I hope it's obvious to everybody in this room that if when kids are asked to read a difficult text, the teacher says, no, that's okay. I'm going to put you in an easier text. Or I'm going to read this to you so you don't have to. Or I'll tell you what it says so that it won't matter if you read it or not. Or I'll ignore the problem of the fact that you can't read it, and I'll just move on. Those aren't going to work. Those aren't going to raise reading achievement. So your standards are lovely, but our practices aren't in line with them in any reasonable way. Now, I said I wanted to talk a bit about this idea of teaching kids with easier text. This is something I was taught in school when I was becoming a teacher, that it wasn't just an option. It wasn't just a way of getting around hard text. We were told that you had to teach students at their level or they weren't going to learn. Any of you told that? You ever hear of the instructional level? Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. The basic idea has been that students learn to read best from texts that are relatively easy. And I'm not saying with no challenge, but with a very, very small amount of challenge, where the youngsters are going to be able to actually read the text pretty well on their own. Various experts have claimed that if the books are too hard, students won't be able to learn from them. So the trick has been you've got to figure out how to test these kids and identify what levels they are and match them up with books. And we've got to have book rooms so that we can do that. And we've got to have little dots on all the books so we can make sure everybody's reading at their level. Heck, there are schools that have their whole library collection dotted so they can make sure that nobody reads a book that's too hard for them. Wouldn't that be painful? We did a survey a few years ago. It says 2013, but we collected the data in 2010. That was the year the Common Core standards came out. And then we collected these data from ELA teachers who taught reading between the grades 4th grade and 11th grade, I believe. We'd ask them a whole bunch of questions, but one of the questions that we asked them had to do with how they place students in text. And we gave them, it was one of those, survey kinds of things, multiple choice, places to write in and so on. But we asked them a question. How do you usually, match kids to books? Do you do it by grade level? Do you do it by reading level? Do you do it by some combination of those things? Do you do it by interest? Do you do it by some other scheme? Please write it in. 64% of those 4th and 5th grade teachers, in other words, 2/3 of them, said they always did it by reading level. They made sure that kids were going to be in those relatively easy texts. What that usually means is they're going to teach kids with below grade level material. So, you can raise the levels of the text all you want to. I'm going to go back and find the easier books and teach them with those. More than 1/3 of the middle school teachers said they did that as well. And in fact, even 1/4 of the high school teachers said that they did that they chose primarily on the basis of text level. So this is not a practice that a few schools use. This is a very, very, widely used practice. Do you know where it came from? It wasn't Fountas and Pinnell. I know there are people, oh yeah, it's Fountas and Pinnell, especially younger teachers. They're sure that's where it came from. This actually comes from a reading guru in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, a fellow by the name of Emmett Betts. Betts wrote a very influential textbook that published in 1946. And in that textbook, he put forth the idea that everybody had 3 reading levels. Everybody had an independent reading level, that is, books that they could read very well on their own. They had an instructional level, that is, books that might have a little bit of challenge to them, but under the supervision of a good teacher, the kids could learn from those books. And frustration level text that needed to be avoided at almost any cost, because those were so hard that if you had a youngster working in those books, they frankly wouldn't be able to learn even under the tutelage of a good teacher. Betts was the one who suggested how we could identify these levels, that we would have the kids read grade level passages and answer questions about those, and we'd see how fluent they were and see how their comprehension was. He was the one who came up with the criteria for looking at what in those days we were referring to as informal reading inventories, and in a lot of places those have kind of been replaced by something very similar, running records these days. He was the one who came up with the criteria that said if a student was asked to read a text that they could read with 95 to 98% accuracy, that is, if you ask the youngster to read 100 words, if they could read 95 to 98% of those words correctly, that would be instructional level. And the reading comprehension at instructional level should be like 75 to 89%. In other words, this is a text the kid can almost read perfectly all by himself, and that's the ones we're going to use to teach with. And Betts went farther than that. Betts said that their studies had shown that if you taught kids at their instructional level, they did better. They made bigger gains in reading. It's not a surprise that reading teachers, people like me, for instance, I used to test the heck out of my kids at the beginning of the year. Everybody took an informal reading inventory that I administered one-on-one to make sure I could identify everybody's instructional level and get them in the right book so that they could learn, because I certainly wanted my kids to learn. I actually believed that it was one of the reasons why people thought I was a good teacher, but because I was doing so well because of teaching kids at their instructional level. Later on, when I became a college professor and was doing research and stuff, I was shocked when I went back and read the study that Betts had talked about in his textbook. The study had never been published, but I went and hunted down the doctoral dissertation that one of his students had done under his supervision. And I was stunned when I looked at it and found that they hadn't actually done the study that Betts talked about. They didn't. They did a study, but their study, well, there were other folks who figured this out later on as well. They went to them later and they said, where did these criteria come from? Because they didn't come out of the study. And they, for deciding what levels of books to put the kids and so on. And they said, well, we really don't remember where we got that 75 to 89% comprehension. We just made it up. And what the study did is they somehow decided that you had to have 75 to 89% comprehension if you were going to learn from the text. And what the study did is they took a small group of fourth graders, they had them read some texts aloud and answer some questions about the text. And what they were looking for was, what's the largest number of mistakes, oral reading mistakes the kids can make when they're reading those texts and still get that 75 to 89% comprehension. That was what the study was. That's where the 95 to 98% came from. The typical kid, if he'd made more than 5 errors, wasn't able to hit that comprehension level, and therefore, that was the level you shouldn't be teaching kids. You were getting, into that frustration territory. I was stunned. I wrote an article about it, but I didn't know what to do. I kind of stuck it in a drawer. I was afraid of it, because what do we do if that isn't right? How do we teach these kids to read? We had no methodology for it. You'd be an idiot to come up with any methodology for teaching kids how to read complex text if you believe that teaching kids with complex text was harmful to kids. Who would want to come out and say, oh, I like to hurt kids. I've got a bunch of ideas how you could do it. I mean, that's crazy. Fortunately, there have been a handful of studies on this topic that have been done since. I'm going to do this super quickly. I'm going to talk about each of these, but brief. Back in the 1960s, and actually Powell did a series of these studies in the 60s, 70s, and I think even into the 80s. What he did, he bought the notion of the instructional level. He thought Betts was absolutely right. There was an instructional level, and if you matched text with kids in the right way, you would get optimum learning. So, he buys the notion. He buys the whole theory. He just thinks the criteria are screwed up. He thinks the books that they're putting kids in are actually too easy. And the reason he thinks that is because he does a series of studies, much larger than the original study that Kilgallen and Betts did. And they did it not just with fourth graders, they did it first, second, third, fourth, all the way up to eighth grade. So they had all these different grade levels. And Betts did exactly the same study. We want to see that 75 to 89% comprehension. What's the best fluency, what's the worst fluency you can accept and still see those kinds of comprehension scores? He came to two conclusions. One conclusion was, wow, there is no consistent pattern here. And in fact, he concluded there isn't one instructional level, there are a whole bunch of them. There are different instructional levels for different grade levels. The kids could tolerate more disfluency at some levels and still comprehend well, and therefore you should be teaching those kids in harder texts than we've been teaching them. And the second conclusion was that, in fact, in some cases, those instructional levels that Powell was coming up with were actually considerably higher and harder than what Betts was having kids taught at. Powell's work is widely cited in the field of reading, but he's always been cited as a kook. He went to his grave knowing that his field thought he was ridiculous. Typically it'll say something, you'll read about things like the instructional level, and they'll talk about how Betts and Kilgallen came up with these wonderful criteria, and then this guy Powell has his own criteria that are kind of a little off. What's interesting is, of course, Powell had a lot of data, a lot of grade levels, and these guys didn't, and yet we kind of buy the one that isn't very data-driven. Second study on the list, Dunkeld. Colin Dunkeld, actually one of Powell's graduate students, he did a study. Not an experiment. He didn't intervene and change people's practice and stuff like that. He literally just went and tested a bunch of kids, second graders, to figure out what how well they could read the books that they were going to be taught from. So essentially gave informal reading inventories based on the text that kids were going to be taught at the levels they were going to be taught. And then essentially watched those kids for a year and tested them at the end of the year to see how much reading growth kids did. And of course that's going to be varied. Some kids are going to have a lot of reading growth, some are going to have a small amount. But what he looked for is for the kids who were getting the biggest reading gains, what was the match of text to their level? Were they in easier texts? Were they in harder texts? And what he was finding, very much what Powell was predicting from his data, he was finding that, frankly, kids were doing better, were learning more when they were being taught from books that, heck, they could only read 85% of the words. Stuff is never cited. No one ever pays attention to Dunkeld. Similar study done by a fellow named Jorgensen found... But it's a similar kind of study that he did, again, a correlational study where he went in, tested kids to find out what their level was according to the Betts criteria, and then looked at what the teacher was doing. So, gee, you read at a fifth grade level according to the test, but the teacher has you in a fourth grade book, or a sixth grade book, or a fifth grade, and so we could see how good the match was. People cite this study to show that I'm wrong, that people have studied this, but they don't like to tell you the results. Because the results were that he found no correlation between how kids were matched to the text and how much learning they were doing. It was absolutely inconsequential. 2000, Alyssa Morgan and her colleagues do a study. The first, finally, someone is going to do an experimental study. Let's try this out. Let's see if this idea that's been around for more than 50 years works. Man, I would love if the drug industry worked like this. I could be so rich. I've got a pill you guys could take, and it'll take care of anything you've got. You just have to give me a lot of money for it. And in 50 years, we're going to test it to see if it works. You think they are doing that? Well, okay, it could be. In Morgan, again at second grade level, she tests a bunch of kids with the Betts criteria. She figures out what their levels are. And she randomly assigns these students to one of 3 treatment groups. Your section's over against that wall. You guys are going to be one of our groups. Let's say I've tested you. I find you're reading at a second grade level. I'm going to teach you with a second grade book. In other words, I'm going to match you just the way that Bet says you're going to be taught at your instructional level. You guys here in the middle, you're just like them. Remember, random assignment. But what I'm going to do with you guys, you read at a second grade level, I'm going to put you in a fourth grade book. I'm going to put you 2 grade levels above your reading level. In other words, clearly frustration level material. And you guys, and again, you're just like them. You read at a second grade level, I'm going to put you in a 6th grade book. I'm going to put you 4 grade levels above. Now, you know how this is supposed to work. The guys over against that wall are going to make the biggest gains because they're matched to the text. You guys might learn something, but you're not going to learn as much as them. And these guys are going to burn down the school. They're going to be so frustrated. What do we say? It'll be like reading hieroglyphics. They do this for a school year. They come back. They test the kids. You'll be pleased to know all the groups made some gains. And you kids who are so perfectly matched to your text the way that we always tell you to do, you made the lowest gains of anybody. You learned less than these 2 groups. This middle group, this group that was placed 2 grade levels above their reading level, outperformed those kids at the year. They got all the learning they did plus almost an entire additional school year, like 75% of a school year. And you guys that I said were going to be such a disaster, you didn't do as well as that middle group, but you were about halfway in between the 2 groups. You were certainly better than the group against the wall over there. They used to not cite this study. It's published in a very good place. It's a well-done study. And yet, no one was paying attention to it. And as I hammered at it, now we're starting to get to some response, because you can't deny that the study is there. And so now the attack on it isn't just, let's ignore it so nobody will know. Now the complaint about it has to do with, well, of course Morgan found that you could teach kids successfully with higher text, but you wouldn't want to do that because our teachers don't have those kinds of skills. The average teacher wouldn't be able to scaffold at the level that the kids were scaffolded when they were working through those texts in the Morgan study. And since our teachers aren't up to the level of that quality, this would be a foolish thing to do. Anybody curious about the scaffolding that was provided in that study? Let's see if you think teachers can do it here, because I know my teachers in Chicago could do it, often did. They had essentially what they did is they paired the kids up in the classroom, the better readers with the poorer readers. Yeah, the scaffolding was done by the 7-year-olds. Untrained 7-year-olds at that. Now, they were the better readers, I admit. Isn't there a TV show like that? You know, can you scaffold as well as a 7-year-old? I think it's Renata O'Connor. I've got 2 numbers up there, 2002, 2010. O'Connor is a scrupulous researcher. She's a special education researcher. She did a study in 2002 where she took a group of students, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades who were learning disabled. And the kids are going to get tutoring. They're going to be tutored, you'll never guess, in what? Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, reading comprehension. And, you know, all one-on-one. And what she did is she takes all these kids, she randomly assigns them to one of 3 treatment groups, same kind of design that I was just describing. One of the groups isn't going to get any tutoring. They're a true control group. They're just going to get their regular classroom instruction. The other 2 groups are going to get this one-on-one tutoring in addition to what they normally get. And the only difference between these 2 groups is one of them is going to be taught, the kids will be taught with text at the kids' grade level, and the other one they'll teach them at the kids' reading level. They do this for a length of time. They come in and they test the kids, and they find just the opposite of what I just told you that Morgan found. O'Connor found that the boys and girls who were tutored at their grade level didn't do as well as the kids who were being taught at their reading level. Now, Just to give you a sense, I said these were third, fourth, and fifth graders. The highest readers, according to their testing, the highest readers were reading at a beginning second grade level. So these were kids who might have been non-readers. They might have been reading like first graders. They might have been reading like second graders. But that was the span of kids. So everybody was at least a year behind, and it sounds like maybe more than that. O'Connor found that the kids who were being taught at their reading level made bigger gains in word reading and bigger gains in word analysis, and I think bigger gains in fluency. She didn't find comprehension gains, but in all those important foundational skills, there clearly was an advantage to being taught at reading level. And that study is cited a lot. People pay a lot of attention to that. Now, there are two things I want to tell you about that study that you need to know. One of them was in the study itself, and that is, I told you O'Connor is a scrupulous researcher. She didn't just look at, let's compare these sets of data. She went and actually looked at the data to see who was doing better. One group did better than another. Some kids contribute more to that than the others. One thing she discovered when she did that, and it's right in the study, was that the kids who got the advantage out of being at their reading level were the lowest readers. Wasn't true for the top part of their group. Now remember, their highest readers were reading beginning second grade level. Their lowest readers were someplace below that. And so I could just write this off and say, see, none of your standards are asking you to teach beginning readers with harder text, so this study's irrelevant. But let's not do that. Let's keep it in the mix. The second thing you need to know about this study was, well, she did publish a second study. She came back in 2010. And in 2010, she and her team say, there was something about that first study that concerned us. We noticed when we were observing the instruction that kids were given that there was a potential confound. In other words, there was another possible explanation. Something had intervened in the study that might be explaining the differences they found, and they wanted to check it out. What they had seen was that they saw a pattern of responding to kids' reading errors that seemed to differ across the groups. In your group, if a youngster was making a mistake, maybe the teacher just told the kids the words, and in yours, the teachers were having the kids figure the words out. So she decided, let's go back and see if we can replicate this study, but we're going to make one change. We're going to have everybody respond to the errors in exactly the same way, so that we take that away as an explanation. And she did that. And she found absolutely no difference. These learning disabled third, fourth, and fifth graders did absolutely as well, made just as much reading gain if they were working with their grade level text or if they were working with their reading level text. So that fifth grader who maybe would have been taught in a second grade book or a first grade book, all of a sudden was being taught in a fifth grade book and doing just as well. I reported this at an IDA, at International Dyslexia Association conference. And at some point in the talk, a group of disabled youngsters started to cheer. Now you've noticed I haven't gotten any cheers this morning, but these kids cheered. And I looked over to where they were sitting, and their mothers were crying. There were tears running down their face. And I haven't, maybe in the back a little bit, but most of that gentleman over there, most of them haven't been crying here either. As soon as I got done with the talk, I made a beeline over to this group to find out what the heck was going on. And what they'd said to me, what one of these teenagers said to me is, what you're saying is we don't have to work in the stupid books anymore. Kind of interesting. It's funny, the O'Connor study, the 2002 study is cited a lot. 2010 study, not so much. People don't like to talk about it. And these last two, Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues did a series of studies, second and third grade, where they essentially had their scheme for teaching reading, where they had kids working at grade level books, and they put it up against guided reading, where the kids were placed at their levels, and they found substantial advantages to teaching kids at their grade levels as opposed to the reading levels. And the Brown study, which is just a replication of the Morgan study but with third graders, This one didn't find an advantage to being in the harder text, but also didn't find any disadvantage. There was no benefit from it. What I'm telling you is, given the entire body of research on this topic, there isn't a single study that supports the idea of teaching kids at their reading level. I'm not leaving out the ones that found that. I've talked you through the entire set. We have a practice that we have claimed is scientific because somebody claimed they had a study on it, which they hadn't really done. We've ignored all these attempts to understand, how this works. And in every single case, it's either made no difference, so the kids, there was no reason to hold them back from the things at the kids' interest level, the things at the kids' cognitive level, the things at their age level. There's no reason to put them in the stupid books. I think we've made a huge mistake. So that raises the question, should we just buy harder books and throw the kids in there and tell the teachers not to adjust instruction for the different kids? And I'd say no, because I think there's a reason why so many of us bought into what Betts and others were saying. We bought into it because we know what happens in classrooms where kids can't read the books. We know what that looks like, and it doesn't make any sense. And so I think the suggestion is it's not going to be enough to put kids in harder text. You're going to have to adjust instruction somehow. The traditional theory said that there were two things you had to worry about. How well does the kid read? How tough is the book? If you can bring those into the right balance, you're going to get learning. And we do get learning, just not as much as we might get some other way. When Powell was asked to explain how kids were supposed to learn from these harder text placements, he just re-articulated the problem that it wasn't just a 2-variable problem, it's a 3-variable problem. Yes, it matters how hard the text is, and yes, it matters how well little Johnny can read. But the third variable is a teacher. These kids aren't there to teach themselves to read. We're supposed to be doing that. We can scaffold, we can add explanation, we can guide kids to read text in ways that allow them to learn even from that harder text. Is there any evidence that that's possible? Is there any evidence that we can actually place kids in frustration level text and scaffold it somehow so that they read it more like instructional level text? In fact, there are quite a few studies. See all those? Those are studies that did exactly that. They intentionally place kids in texts that they're going to have trouble reading. They intervene somehow, and those texts get easier. The kids learn from them. They get better and read in them. And in fact, in some cases, the texts end up at the kids' instructional level. I've come to believe the instructional level probably needs to be the goal, not the start-in point. That we want to get our kids to the point where they can read a text with 95% accuracy and where they can read it with that 75 to 90%. That's not the start-in point. You don't look for books that kids can already read well and say, oh, I'll teach them that. You go the other way. Here's a book that youngster's going to have trouble with. Let's see if I can teach him well enough that he can read it that well. Oh, wait, these studies too, by the way. I don't have a lot of time, but what I want to do with everything that's left is I want to talk to you about what some of that instruction would look like. One of the things that, in fact, let's see if I can do two. I want to show you one scaffold that everybody uses badly. I mean, we all use it. And one that, frankly, we don't use much at all. And there are many more. There are lots of different scaffolds we could use. One really simple to understand one is, what if we go through and figure out some of the vocabulary the youngster's likely to have difficulty with, and we help them with it somehow. We pre-teach it, or we somehow support that so that those words don't become the barrier I was talking about. I don't think I have ever seen a textbook that doesn't recommend pre-teaching certain vocabulary. I don't think I have ever seen a teacher's lesson plan on any of these websites that doesn't pull out the vocabulary that they think that needs to be pre-taught. So this is something that's widely used. It makes great sense. If the author's going to use vocabulary up here, we could wait till little Jimmy's vocabulary gets equal with the author's, or we could actually teach him the specific vocabulary that's going to hold him back. Makes sense, right? And there's studies showing that it works. See this passage, fourth grade passage. Photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into two parts. Photo is the Greek word for light. Synthesis is the Greek word for putting together, which explains what photosynthesis is. It's using light to put things together. You may have noticed that all animals and humans eat food, but plants don't eat anything. Photosynthesis is how plants eat. Guess what words the publishing company wants you to pre-teach? Ah, you got it. I would argue that is the one word there you should not pre-teach. That's a good comprehension question, what is photosynthesis? If the passage is going to explain a term, why are we pre-teaching the term? Are you the kind of people who like to sneak in the punchline of somebody else's joke, you know? You're not making the youngster read better, you're making it so the youngster doesn't need to read at all. If you think some of the words that are used to explain photosynthesis might not be known by your kids, feel free to pre-teach those. That could really help them make sense of this. Or better yet, give them a glossary, put it on the whiteboard, give them a handout. Gee, there are 10 words here I thought you might have some difficulty with, so here are simple definitions of them. Or look at this one. Some scientists have argued that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt, sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. And I've highlighted 3 words that clearly are not defined there explicitly. But are there any that you think the kids could figure out from context? Are there any that you think they might get? Give me one. Which one do you think they'll get? You think they'll get seeps. And there are reasons why you think that, right? Because the oil is somehow leaking or dripping into the ocean, we know. So why are we pre-teaching seeps? Why aren't we making seeps a comprehension question? Why aren't we turning it around instead of trying to get ahead of the kids? I know that most of these programs will have a lesson, they'll have some skill sheets on, using context. But why, when it comes to vocabulary, if an author is either going to define a word or is going to use a word so clearly with supportive context that you should be able to figure it out, would you ever pre-teach any of those? Every one of those should become a question. If you think the kids can get it, I don't think they're going to get effect, then pre-teach it. Feel free. I think they're going to get seeps. You might be wrong about this. You could be wrong. We're going to find that out once they've read it, and we'll ask them what it means, or we'll say, what does the oil do? Or what's the relationship of the oil in the ocean? However you want to ask it. And if they can't answer it, we're not just going to say, no, you're wrong. We're going to go back to the text and show them how to figure it out. That's not something that should happen on an occasional skill sheet. That should happen every day when the kids are reading. I'm going to skip this because I want to show you, I said I was going to show you 2. There's a whole bunch of ideas on vocabulary there. Sentence structure. Explain clearly using at least 3 different reasons or drawing 3 diagrams why McClellan lost the battle. Or explain clearly why McClellan lost the battle, give at least 3 reasons, or draw 3 diagrams. Which of those is easier to understand? The bottom one, the second one? Yeah, I think most people find that easier. Here's our problem, ladies and gentlemen. Both of those are in good English. There's no problem with the grammar of either of those. Why do we keep taking, if the kids are going to have trouble with the first one, why do we keep dropping them back? Let's put them in an easier text instead of teaching them how to read the first one. This is out of a 5th grade book, or a 5th grade book now, given the new standards. However, on August 24, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. My hunch is, it's a guess, it's a prediction. My guess is the typical 10-year-old asked to read that sentence is going to get the heebie-jeebies. They're not going to have a clue what it's telling them. The reason I'm betting that, one, it's 26 words long. As sentences get longer, they put memory load on. It has, I think, 5 commas in it, which suggests there's a lot of embedding and relations that you have to tease out. There's an acronym, there are parentheses, there are numbers. Is there a verb? Anyone find one? Made, yeah, the 24th word in the sentence. It's almost German. Some German constructions, you put the verb at the end. That's problematic because what linguists tell us is when you interpret a sentence, what your head is doing, what you're doing in your mind, you might not be aware of it, is you're looking for the verb. We interpret sentences from the verb out. You find the verb and then you start connecting ideas to it. If you have to wait all the way to the 24th word, that makes this text very different from oral language. And so there are going to be a lot of kids who they don't know they're looking for it. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International asked, to hell with it. I can't find a verb. I would definitely ask the kids what I asked you. Can you find a verb in that sentence? But see, I'm not going to even know that this is an issue unless I look at the text and say, which sentences could be a barrier to learning? Which ones might my kids have difficulty making sense of? And then making darn sure I have a question about that. Yeah, but this isn't the most important idea. Our discussions are going to be about, yeah, but I would put in a question like, what did the IAU do? If the kids can answer it, I was wrong. It wasn't that hard a sentence. If they can't answer it, we've got to go back to the text and start showing them how you'd make sense of this. One way to do that might be this kind of a, it's kind of a sentence diagram, but it's a very light one. You see that the blue, that's the subject. Do you see why the verb gets hidden? In science writing, the subjects are getting longer and longer, and the verbs in English are going farther and farther into the sentence. This is something that's been going on for more than 100 years in our language. It's a big change in our language, being led by scientific writing, but it's not just there. Or another possibility might be intensive questioning. There's not one way to do this. Who was this sentence about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they do that? That kind of thing. Guiding kids through it so that when they hit a sentence like that, they don't feel like they're overwhelmed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have spent the last 70 years trying to protect our boys and girls from having to learn how to read more complex text. The hope has been they'd teach themselves on their own when they selected books that perhaps would be harder than the ones we were going to teach them at school. That has maybe worked reasonably well for the most advantaged kids in our society. It has not worked so wonderfully well for the boys and girls who don't have all those advantages. The standards point the way to exposing kids to, teaching kids with, and in fact, trying to teach them to read text at these harder levels. But just having some text that's at those levels and being willing to place kids in them is not going to get kids over those barriers, is not going to show them how to make sense of those. Giving kids guidance in vocabulary, giving kids guidance in breaking down sentences, giving kids guidance in lots of areas I didn't talk about, like building up their prior knowledge on a particular topic, or showing them how to make certain cohesive connections, or how to use text structure, or how to pull out the tone from a text, or how to analyze certain kinds of content. And we can kind of go on and on and on. There are lots of examples in this PowerPoint of other instructional supports. There's not a single set of supports. Kids have to learn to deal with all of these. If you're willing to do that, if you're willing to expose kids to these harder texts, to hold them accountable for reading them, and for guiding them to reading them successfully so that those kids learn how to figure out text, you can make this a much more equal society, a much fairer society, and one where a much higher percentage of our boys and girls are able, through their reading ability, to take advantage of the wonderful economic and social and civic benefits that this society provides to some of us, but not to all. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. Thank you.